after the introductory verse to the book of James, the first major section we have is chapter 1, verses 2 to 11. And maybe this is the first time you've been reading this in Greek. I don't know if you've read this before, but even picking up on the word plays is kind of exciting for a reader of the Greek New Testament. James was the original alliterating Southern Baptist preacher, I think. You notice how he ends verse 1 with chairein, greetings. And then the second word in verse 2 is charan, right, joy. So he stitched this together with a similar sound. And then you can hear the alliteration, the repetition here in verse 2, perasmois peripezeta poikilois, pa 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 pa, right? Very pleasing rhetorically to the ear, more memorable. It's not that it changes propositionally what's being said, but we recognize, we can understand maybe a little better why the pieces are stitched together like they are, why pieces are side by side, and also a very memorable way of expressing them. We could entitle this section, if we give it a title, The Wise Perspective on Trials. And I want to challenge you as you're working through this as a seminary student. Don't just view this as, okay, I'm going to learn proper doctrine and I'm going to understand this doctrinally, but think about how this relates to your own life. Right? James tells us to consider it pure joy, or all joy, whenever we face trials of many kinds. It's real easy to think about that theoretically, other people's trials, right? Or to discount, well, it doesn't mean these minor trials in my life, like a kid crying or me losing my cell phone or this or that. But it's talking about trials of various kinds, whether it's a cancer diagnosis or whether it's dealing with a crying child, right? Or dealing with losing a job, something very serious and potentially extremely disruptive in your life. But to look at these situations and to rejoice, to consider it joy. And you're like, how in the world can I do that? James tells us we can do that because we know that God is using that experience under His loving sovereignty. Even when wicked is done against us by other people, He's using that experience under His loving sovereignty to shape us and mold us to be more mature Christian people, to mold us ultimately into the image of His Son. Right after this, I think again, James doesn't always explicitly say the connection, but right after he talks about rejoicing in trials, he talks about the wisdom and asking for wisdom. And we need supernatural wisdom to rejoice in our trials. And we're encouraged to ask God for that wisdom. So if you're in a difficult trial right now, and over teaching now for many years, I've noticed that students, when they come to seminary, when they start studying for seminary, there's a lot of joy and excitement, but then many times very difficult and unexpected trials come. And when those come, cry out to God and ask for wisdom. Say, God, enable me, please, God, enable me to have joy in this, because I know You are still in control. I know You're sovereign, and I know You will use this to make me more like Jesus. He goes on after talking about wisdom and asking for wisdom to speak about poverty and riches. And again, there's no explicit connector in the text like, now this is why I'm talking about poverty and riches. But throughout the history of the world, one of the greatest trials that many people have had to face is extreme poverty. If you think throughout world history, thousands of years, how many people have lived kind of on the edge of starvation? How many people have been oppressed by unjust governments, by unjust rulers? I mean, the abundance that most of us have who are watching this video, or if you're in this class, is kind of unthinkable by historical world standards. But even that, maybe you've left a well-paying job to enter the ministry, maybe you've left, maybe you're scraping by right now. And James tells us in this trial, don't forget, this is a trial you can rejoice in too. Rejoice, he says, in your high status. You're like, I'm a poor person, I'm a poor seminary student, I'm barely scraping by. How am I supposed to rejoice in this? Because we see it from a divine perspective. In God's perspective, you're seated in the heavenlies with Christ. And he goes on to talk about riches. And he says, rich guy, and I think he's addressing Christians here. He says, don't be deceived. You're fading away. Just as a flower is flourishing for a day and then is gone, that's your life. And you can rejoice in your low status, in your humiliation. He's like, what do you mean you're low? Well, that you're a servant. You're a slave of Christ. Even though from a worldly perspective, you're flourishing, you have nice things, don't lose perspective on this, a divine perspective, that this is very temporary, that what you have is what you've been given to love others and to glorify God, and ultimately you're a servant of Christ. So let me challenge you again, as you read through this, you're working through the Greek, you're soaking in this, but take it not just as a Greek workout, as an academic workout, as a doctrinal growing in knowledge, but take it as a personal application in your own life and say, God, where do you want me to rejoice in these trials? And what are you trying to teach me? How are you changing me?